Good morning. The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Somalia. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Somalia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency Mr. Balal Kusman, State Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Somalia. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. James Swan, Special Representative of the Secretary-General and Head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia. Mr. Francisco Madeira, the Special Representative of the Chairperson of the African Union Commission for Somalia and Head of the African Union Mission in Somalia. And Ms. Rita Larangina, Managing Director of the European External Action Service. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2021/154, the report of the Secretary-General on the situation in Somalia. I now give the floor to Mr. James Swan. You have the floor.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, thank you for this opportunity once again to update the Council on the situation in Somalia. I'm also pleased to appear jointly at the start with my dear colleague, Ambassador Francisco Madeira, Special Representative of the Chairperson of the African Union Commission. And let me take this opportunity at the beginning of this session to pay tribute to the commitment and sacrifice of AMISOM forces in Somalia since 2007, alongside courageous Somali forces. Today's meeting of the Council is timely in view of the significant developments in Somalia over the last several weeks and even days. Growing political tensions threaten Somalia's state-building progress and even security, unless they are resolved through dialogue and compromise in the interest of the country. Unfortunately, instead we are seeing increased brinkmanship, pressure tactics, and tests of strength that can only heighten risks. The political standoff among key Somali leaders has blocked implementation of the electoral model agreed by the federal government of Somalia president and federal member state leaders on 17 September 2020. This model was formally endorsed by both houses of parliament and supported by all other major political actors, but implementation is in dispute. I will return to this point. Tensions over electoral implementation have now been compounded by questions raised by some political figures over the legitimacy of the president's mandate following expiry of his constitutional term on 8 February. The government cites an October parliamentary resolution permitting the president to remain, but this is contested by others. Meanwhile, on the morning of February 19th, a day of protests announced by the Opposition Council of Presidential Candidates. On that day, several violent incidents were reported. Although full details are unconfirmed, these incidents reportedly included armed exchanges between government security personnel and security teams employed by the opposition, as well as recourse to live fire by government forces to disperse protesters. Public communication from key leaders has become increasingly polemical and confrontational, revealing the frustration, mistrust, and sense of grievance felt by many. Hence, this is a tense moment in Somalia, as both rhetoric and actions are escalating. Madam President, in light of the above, let me briefly recap recent efforts to move forward with implementation of the 17 September electoral model. At the invitation of the federal government, FGS and FMS leaders met in Dusamareb from 2 to 6 February and made progress, but reached no final agreement on the contentious issues namely the composition of the electoral management bodies, the modalities for selecting representatives from Somaliland in federal institutions, and the management of elections in the Ghetto region of Jubaland State. Subsequently, the federal government convened a technical committee of senior ministers from the FGS and FMS, who met in Baidoa from 15 to 16 February. The committee announced that it had arrived at technical solutions for the contentious issues. It reaffirmed commitment to the 30% women's quota in the electoral process, and it noted the need for a revised but short new electoral calendar. On the basis of the committee's work, the federal government called for an FGS-FMS Leaders Summit to be held in Mogadishu from 18 to 19 February. Yet events of recent days have disrupted these plans, and the leaders of Jubaland and Puntland have so far, regrettably, declined to join the FGS and other FMSs for a summit. Along with other partners, we continue efforts to understand and address the concerns of these two leaders so that they may join the process to advance the 17 September agreement. In view of this worrying impasse, in recent days, I have worked closely alongside other regional and international partners to engage FGS and FMS leaders, key political figures, and civil society representatives to urge a way forward based on dialogue and compromise in the national interest. The message from partners has been clear that there should be no partial elections, no parallel processes, and no unilateral actions by Somali leaders. Such approaches would only lead to greater division and risk of confrontation. Madam President, let me be clear. I remain convinced that the consensus-based 17 September model offers the best available option to proceed quickly to an electoral process for selection of members of parliament, senators, and the president. This would minimize further delays in Somalia's 4-year transition cycle, ensure that the chosen national leaders have a clear mandate and are widely accepted, and allow the country to turn its attention from the current political competition to other vital national priorities in the interests of the people. To move forward on this path, it is imperative that Somali leaders use all available channels for dialogue and consultation, including contacts with a wide range of political stakeholders and influential civil society figures so that their important voices are heard. To build trust in this process, it will also be necessary to ensure that the management and oversight of the agreed electoral process are as impartial and independent as possible and subject to regular monitoring. Core political freedoms, including those of speech, assembly, organization, and access to media, must be ensured, and communication among the main actors, and especially the FGS and FMS leaders, must continue on a regular and frequent basis to minimize future misunderstandings and resolve problems before they escalate. The United Nations and other international partners stand ready to walk with Somalis on this path forward through providing good offices or a forum for dialogue, offering technical assistance to the process, and monitoring implementation of commitments should the Somali parties find these contributions useful. The longer national political attention continues to be focused on the current impasse over holding elections, the greater will be the negative impact on other priorities, such as advancing security and economic reforms, finalizing the Constitution, and pursuing the development agenda. Madam President, Al-Shabaab continues to pose the primary threat to the security of the country. Al-Shabaab has increased its operational tempo since August 2020, and the beginning of 2021 has seen a new peak in the number of attacks, including more person-borne and vehicle-borne IEDs, targeting government officials and key figures in Somali society. Important military gains were made by Somali security forces backed by AMISOM in the Lower Shabelle region in early 2019 and again in early 2020. And these are now being consolidated to enable further progress against Al-Shabaab in other areas. UNSOS has remained steadfast in delivery of support to AMISOM and eligible Somali forces throughout this period, despite the complications of the COVID pandemic. Meanwhile, preparatory work has been completed to advance the security transition in Somalia in 2021, as requested by this Council. The federal government organized meetings of the Security and Justice Committee, as well as the Somalia Partnership Forum in early December, thereby advancing the comprehensive approach to security and the mutual accountability framework. We encourage the government to continue these efforts and to hold the Force Generation Conference announced by the Prime Minister as soon as possible. The Council mandated independent assessment of the security situation and the role of international partners was submitted to the Council on January 8th, and the Somalia Transition Plan was updated and presented by the Somali government to security partners and the African Union PSC in early February. These are all important elements to advance the security transition this year and lay the foundations for further progress in the future. Madam President, the humanitarian situation remains dire. The number of people in need of assistance will increase from 5.2 million persons last year to an estimated 5.9 million persons in 2021. This is the result of increasing food insecurity, climatic disasters, the worst desert locust infestation in decades, and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, in recent weeks, we have seen a renewed spike in COVID cases in Somalia, which will only exacerbate the already difficult humanitarian situation. Somalia is eligible for the COVAX vaccine program, and the United Nations, in close collaboration with the Somali authorities, will ensure that the first batch of vaccines is effectively distributed to frontline workers and vulnerable groups across the country. While we are deeply grateful for the generous donor contributions in 2020, the humanitarian needs will continue to be high, and we again appeal for donor support to the Humanitarian Response Plan for 2021, for which $1.09 billion is requested. The UN family also continues to work with Somali authorities and partners on longer-term solutions to these recurrent humanitarian shocks. For example, our mission's environmental advisor is engaging the government to develop climate-related policies and strategies, as well as practical responses to flood and drought cycles impacted by climatic conditions. Finally, Madam President, while these quarterly briefings typically focus on the latest political, security, and humanitarian developments, we must always remain mindful that enduring positive change for Somalis will require institution building, improvements in governance through many elements, including constitutional reform, investment in health and education, greater participation by women, youth, and marginalized groups, and other long-term reforms. The UN in Somalia continues its work with Somalis in all these areas, knowing this will take persistence and perseverance. It is also imperative that these larger future goals be borne in mind by Somalia's political leaders. The Somali people have waited a long time to see progress, and it remains fragile. That is why I conclude by urging all of Somalia's political leaders to pull back from confrontation and avoid risky winner-take-all tactics. Instead, this is a time to pursue dialogue and compromise, to reach an inclusive and credible political agreement to hold elections as soon as possible based on the 17 September model. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Swan for his briefing. Before moving to Mr. Francisco Madeira, I'd like to correct the Article 37 briefing details. The representative of Somalia is in fact His Excellency Mr. Abdirizak Mohammed, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. I apologise for the earlier misinformation. I now give the floor to Mr. Francisco Madeira. You have the floor.
Madam President, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Security Council on Somalia once again. Let me start by congratulating the United Kingdom for its presidency of the Security Council for the month of February. Today's meeting is taking place in the aftermath of the 19 and 20 February events, which, as my colleague James Swan has described. And these events resulted in the eruption of armed clashes in Mogadishu as Somalia political leaders struggle to unblock the current political impasse and allow the country to hold peaceful, inclusive, and transparent elections. The chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Mohammed, demanded restraint and urged Somali stakeholders to refrain from acts that can escalate tension and lead to further violence. He reiterated the importance and absolute necessity for elections as a means for the renewal and reaffirmation of people's trust and confidence in their leaders, and for the consolidation of peace, stability, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Somalia. Madam President, the armed clashes of 19 and 20 February have died down and stopped. But the political tension and the underlying causes that led to those clashes have not. It is therefore important that Somali stakeholders return to the negotiating table, remain focused, continue with their dialogue, guided by the spirit of constructiveness, compromise, and consensus, to agree on a credible process that can, in a peaceful and conducive environment, deliver free and transparent election in conformity with the 17 September agreement. A lot has already been achieved in this regard. The leaders of the FGS and FMS, the two chambers of the National Parliament, the Council of Presidential Candidates, the business community, and the civil society organizations have all recognized and endorsed the 17 September agreement. The 19th and 20th February clashes did not question the validity of the September 17th agreement. This means that all are in agreement with the need to implement the processes as agreed in the 17th September agreement. The recently held by Doha technical discussions, to which all the FMS sent delegates and experts and participated actively. Technical discussions to which all the FMS, they came up with proposals which all participants unanimously adopted and recommended the FGS and FMS leaders to meet, endorse, and agree on a roadmap for their implementation and for the elections, leading to elections. Madam President, it is important that the leaders come up with a specific date to meet and look into these proposals which possess the key to overcoming the technical hurdles that have impeded the 17 September agreement from being implemented and elections from being held and delivered. But the events of 19 and 20 February took place after the Baidoa proposals were already released, and a draft and a date for a meeting of the leaders to look into them had been proposed. That meeting did not take place. A space, therefore, must be created to carefully look into this, and we, international partners, should support the Somali stakeholders in this endeavor. Maintaining channels of communication and dialogue remain vital tools in this effort. I'm glad to know that all the stakeholders have affirmed and stated their readiness to dialogue. But it's important that all reaffirm the urgency of this dialogue and their readiness to participate in the dialogue as soon as possible. There are some that have reservations. It's important to overcome those reservations and come to the table. Madam President, despite the above challenges and delays, AMISOM continues to deliver on its election-related responsibilities, particularly with regards to the provision of election security, training, and technical support. In delivering these tasks, there has been an enhanced and more complementary collaboration and coordination between AMISOM police and the Somali police, between AMISOM civilian component and their counterparts in government departments, journalists, and the civil society organization. AMISOM military and the SNA have also been coordinating. This multifaceted interaction and collaboration will be very, very necessary and important during the actual election process. With regards to security, I would say, Madam President, that generally the situation remains volatile. Al-Shabaab is strategically positioning itself with a view to maximizing its capacity to thwart the upcoming electoral process. In this regard, it places particular focus on Mogadishu, where it continues to unleash its deadly attacks, both through targeted assassinations and wide-scale destructive bombs. Beyond Mogadishu and in AMISOM areas of operation, we continue to observe three emerging tactics of Al-Shabaab with the obvious goal of destabilizing the elections in the federal member states. First, Al-Shabaab has been mobilizing forces as part of its plans to retake key locations in Lower and Middle Shabelle, so as to facilitate the deployment of deadly operations in the Banadir region. Second, particularly in Bay and Bakol, Al-Shabaab has placed emphasis on conducting disruptive operations, targeting humanitarian aid convoys, and in some cases, cargo planes carrying goods and people. Third, Al-Shabaab is extending its tentacles and making its presence increasingly felt in Galmudug. This has led to the group intensifying its attacks in that member state in recent months, such as the Galkayo Stadium attack last December. Madam President, however, despite the COVID-19 pandemic and the limitations imposed by seasonal rains, we in AMISOM have been able to contain Al-Shabaab activities through enhanced collaboration and joint operations with the Somali National Forces, and allow life to evolve in relative security in most population centers across AMISOM areas of operation. In implementing its transition obligations under the Operation Badbadu 1, with the exception of the capture of Basra town, AMISOM has successfully completed its transition tasks in the Lower Shabelle. The completion of Operation Barbabi 1 will now allow AMISOM to commence transition operations in the Middle Shabelle. This new phase of operations will be greatly enhanced by the recent deployment of 4 helicopters from the Republic of Uganda. I thank the government of Uganda for effectively put at the disposal of our force commander these very important and very effective war machines. In accordance with Security Council Resolution 2420, I can report that AMISOM has also commenced implementing its reconfiguration as agreed at the joint AMISOM SNA Sector Commanders Conference in October 2020, with the key tasks endorsed at the Operation Coordination Committee also in October 2020, and widely welcomed by international partners at the European Union security event on Somalia in November 2020. Madam President, the African Union remains committed to working closely and in coordination and complementarity with the Somali security forces with a view to further strengthening and expediting their taking over of security responsibility from AMISOM. It is in this context that the African Union Peace and Security Council, in its recent communique, took note of the progress of the Somalia Transition Plan review. In the area of operations, the success of the transition plan will very much depend on our capacity to expedite the generation of a well-trained, well-equipped, well-supported, and capable Somali army. Without a very clear, resourced, and implementable force generation plan, the discussions we've been having and the decision we've been taking on the transition will be profoundly compromised. The African Union strongly believes that the holding of a force generation conference, as soon as practically it is possible, will address the full range of requirements for the success of the ongoing transition agreements and operations. It would also allow international partners to identify resources to ensure that the Somalia Transition Plan implementation does not suffer further setbacks and delays. We also believe that as we continue to support and implement the transition, it must be our collective responsibility to realistically and transparently assess the conditions on the ground. In this connection, as this Council is now aware, the African Union is in the process of conducting its own independent assessment to decide on the future of AMISOM in Somalia post-2021. This assessment will also allow AMISOM to further reconfigure to better support Somalia's security and broader stabilization priorities and requirements. We respect the independence and sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Somalia. We respect the decisions taken by the sovereign state of Somalia. But we are ready to work with them, listen to them, exchange with them, and agree on joint operations, both at the military front, police front, political front, and stabilization, capacity building front. Madam President, Later this week, the Council will review AMISOM's mandate. Since AMISOM deployment in 2007, the mission has continued to achieve its strategic objectives. This has come at a huge human cost for AMISOM. These AMISOM sacrifices, together with those of the Somali security forces, have, over the last 14 years, resulted in the creation of a physical space where life evolves in relative safety, where political dialogue and reconciliation can take place, where governance, humanitarian relief activities, and extension of state authority can become a reality across Somalia. These are important achievements that we're all proud of. These are achievements that are giving hope to the Somalis. These are achievements that make people believe that Somalia is again back on its feet and becoming a very valid, active, and aggressive member of the international community. Aggressive in the sense of constructive member. The renewal of AMISOM mandate must take into account the prevailing political and security realities prevailing on the ground and the need for us all not to put at risk these hard-won gains. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Madeira for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Rita Larangina. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for the invitation to make this statement on behalf of the EU and its member states. Today, we have 4 messages to deliver. First, that it is critical to put politics at the center. The constitutional 4-year mandate of the President of Somalia ended on 8 February without a political agreement on how elections should be conducted. This is a risk for Somalia, and if not addressed urgently, it will become a risk to regional security. We urge Somali leaders to resume dialogue and to work in a spirit of compromise to overcome the last political hurdles to inclusive elections as soon as possible and respecting the agreements they reached on the 17th September 2020. Together with our partners, we have been calling for calm and restraint by all parties following armed tensions in Mogadishu over the weekend. Parties must all come together without delay to reduce further tensions and seek to break the current political deadlock over the holding of elections. The people of Somalia deserve the full dedication of their leaders to their safety, well-being, and progress. Any progress on the security side can only underpin a political settlement, but cannot deliver it. Conversely, sustainable security relies on political settlement. The government and the federal member states must reconcile and work together to achieve the best prospect for stability by addressing its root causes as well as its symptoms. If Somalia's leaders fail to come to political arrangements, Al-Shabaab and other spoilers will benefit. The gains made to move Somalia to debt relief also risk being squandered. Time is therefore now for us, together, to reinforce our commitment towards a more comprehensive political and stabilization approach. Only this can be a meaningful basis for allowing space for Somalia to lead its security post-2021 and for the African Union, the neighbours and partners to continue providing support. Secondly, Madam President, we need to continue progress on security. Against the backdrop of multiple drivers for conflict within Somalia and across the region, we welcome the progress made in the FGS-led review of the Somali Transition Plan in collaboration with international partners. And we encourage the FGS to finalize its review and formally endorse the STP at the National Security Council with full participation of the federal member states and the high-level Security and Justice Committee. Through the process of reviewing the STP, Somalia has communicated its strategic vision. Having a plan for the future that shows a credible path to Somali security transition is the best way to ensure predictability and stability for Somalia and the region, and to tie down donor support. To continue to support this ongoing process, though, we need to be able to understand how government will extend control across Somalia and what resources will be required. In this regard, we look forward to considering further details at the forthcoming Fourth Generation Conference, as well as through the revised CONOPS concerning the ways and means required to realize the plan's ambitions. The vision set out in the revised STP is testament to AMISOM's success in rebuilding Somali security and the capability of its security forces. It means that over the coming years, the Somali authorities will increasingly need support to enable their own activities rather than relying on external forces. The revised STP is clear that a reconfigured AU mission is best placed to provide this, and also recognizes that a reconfigured mission will need to retain the ability to fight Al-Shabaab. We further acknowledge the conclusion of the independent assessment as mandated by the UN Security Council. Together, these milestones give us an indication of the various options to boost the current security and state-building operation. They offer a better view of what is required to counter the threat from Al-Shabaab and the various other challenges to security and state-building. Strengthening the capacity of Somali security and governance actors in order to take over the responsibility to protect their people must remain a key objective of all of Somalia's partners. However, it is essential to address key questions and details such as force generation, how many is sufficient and for what purpose, training, by whom, to what standard, for what purpose, and how bilateral engagement can support the overall vision. A reinforced mechanism for bringing the different Somali actors and international security providers together to ensure a joint approach seems essential. A more balanced approach should further emphasize the prevention and countering of violent extremism and organized crime, including financing, as a complement to the military engagement both on the land and in the maritime domain to counter the evolving threat. Pivoting to a more comprehensive approach to security and stabilization also necessitates strengthening public administration, especially public financial management, basic service provision, justice, and law enforcement. The EU remains committed to Somalia's state-building efforts. Since 2014, our support has amounted to almost 1.6 billion euro in development and humanitarian assistance. Our investment in the security sector has been substantial, with more than 2.1 billion euro to AMISOM since 2007. We have secured funding for AMISOM until the end of June 2021 in the amount of 100 billion euros. In parallel, we have scaled up our support to provide non-lethal equipment to the Somali security forces engaged in transition operations alongside AMISOM, amounting to 40 million euros for 2019-2020. This has been implemented by UNOPS. The EU has also extended for another 2 years its CSDP missions, UCAP Somalia and EUTM Somalia, which continue to support the capacity building of Somali security forces both on land and at sea. Additionally, Operation Atalanta's mandate was expanded to include secondary executive and non-executive tasks of countering trafficking of weapons and narcotic drugs and monitoring various illegal activities at sea. With these adjustments, Operation Atalanta will support the UN arms embargo on Somalia on the ongoing fight against Al-Shabaab and its funding streams, while at the same time maintaining its core efforts to counter piracy and protect the World Food Programme and other vulnerable shipping to Somalia. The EU's contribution of 23 million euro to the Joint Police Programme, also implemented by UNOPS, complements donor contributions from Germany and the UK. Additionally, our support to UNMAS is enhancing local resilience and capacity to address the problem of explosive hazards in Somalia. Madam President, our third message is linked to the need to rebuild the former regional political consensus that previously existed when AMISOM was launched 10 years ago. The future stability of Somalia lies in a robust and honest political engagement, both within Somalia and with the region. It should be aimed at attaining a lasting political solution with a continuity of engagement from the region to serve as positive enablers. This underlines the necessity of regional and multilateral cooperation, and we welcome the leadership role of the African Union in close cooperation with UN and IGAD. The EU will continue to support a broader engagement between partners across the wider region and wholeheartedly encourages more dialogue in this regard. Our fourth and last message, Madam President, is about the work ahead in 2021 and the need to define a post-2021 security framework. In building and supporting Somalia's vision as expressed in the STP, we need to take into account the situation on the ground. There is broad agreement within the international community that continued support from an international mission is necessary, that more accountability from all stakeholders is needed, and that the African Union is best placed to continue to provide this. It will require strong political engagement by the AU in Somalia to support delivery on both political reforms and security. We recognize that until its full drawdown, the AU will continue to play an important role in supporting the security transition process. And I've heard to Ambassador Madeira carefully about this. Collective efforts are more than ever needed for peace and security in Somalia and the region, as well as to safeguard the progress made. That progress over the years has only been possible due to the sacrifices made by Africa's sons and daughters. Allow me, therefore, to pay tribute to the ultimate price paid by African troop and police contributing countries of AMISOM to peace and security in Somalia. The discussions today in the UN Security Council on AMISOM mandate create an opportunity to generate a shared vision and should lead us further to explore national, regional, and international expectations for Somalia's political and security landscape post-2021. The steps needed in 2021 to prepare for implementation of the STP as the revision of the CONOPS and a reconfigured AU mission in 2022 must be clear. The EU considers that the renewed AMISOM mandate in the UN Security Council should support the mission in this reconfiguration process. It should allow the AU the necessary time, space, and ownership to consider and act upon the conclusions of the various processes, such as the revised STP and the UN independent assessment, as well as its own forthcoming analysis and assessment. We therefore encourage the AU to use this opportunity to set out its own vision, as well as the requirements and commitments needed to ensure that a new mandate contributes to building Somalia's ability to manage its own security in the medium term. With the appropriate political will, this will help ensure that Somalis take leadership and ownership of the country's recovery efforts. The AU's independent assessment and the PSC mandate renewal in May should set a direction which can be captured in a new UN Security Council resolution at the end of December 2021. That the EU thus welcomes a 10 months renewal of the mandate to allow space for discussions on the shape of a post-2021 mission to take place. As regards the EU, while we continue to call on our partners for a more balanced donor structure, our commitment to support peace, stability, and development in Somalia is long-term. Discussions with our member states on a follow-up instrument to fund African peace support operations beyond 2021 are ongoing. This process will be informed by the parameters for Somalia's security architecture post-2021 that, as seen, are yet to be determined in more detail. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Larangina for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Kenya. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The representative of Tunisia is going to read the statement on behalf of A3+1. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Kenya, Niger, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, and Tunisia, the A3+1. At the outset, we would like to convey our thanks to the UN Secretary General and to the chairperson of the African Union Commission for their respective reports on the situation in Somalia. We also thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Assistant Mission in Somalia, Mr. James Swan, the Special Representative of the Chairperson of the African Union Commission for Somalia and Head of the African Union Mission in Somalia, AMISOM, Mr. Francisco Madeira, and the Managing Director for Africa at the European External Action Service, Ms. Rita Larangina, for their briefings. We also would like to recognize the participation of His Excellency Mr. Abdulrazak Mohammed, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Somalia, to this meeting. Our statement will focus on the political developments and the preparations for the elections, the security situation, with a particular attention to the role of AMISOM and the humanitarian situation in Somalia. On the political development, the A3+1 return. On the political developments, the A3+1 reaffirms its full support to a safe, peaceful, and orderly transition in Somalia based on constitutional order, the rule of law, and human rights, and unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Somalia. The A3+1 regrets that the electoral agreement reached by the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states on September 17, 2020, which was subsequently adopted by both houses of parliament, is yet to be fully implemented. As a consequence, the parliamentary elections that were expected by the end of 2020, as well as the election of the speakers of parliament and the president that were to be held by February the 8th, 2021, are yet to take place, leading to heightened tensions and political uncertainties. We deeply regret the violent incidents and the reported casualties last Friday in Mogadishu. While reaffirming the right to peaceful demonstration, we call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to avoid any escalation. We encourage the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states to continue with their ongoing dialogue, guided by the spirit of consensus and readiness for compromise, with a view to reach an agreement on the remaining outstanding issues. In this regard, we welcome the formation for that purpose of a technical team at the ministerial level between the federal government and the federal member states that convened its first meeting on the 15th of this month. We underline the vital importance of holding free, fair, timely, transparent, and credible elections in Somalia to realize the legitimate aspirations to security, stability, democracy, good governance, and development. In this regard, we call upon all the relevant Somali stakeholders to refrain from undertaking any unilateral or non-consensual measures that might further complicate the situation. At the same time, we call for the renewed commitment of Somalia's partners to providing timely and adequate support to the government of Somalia in order to ensure that the electoral process is conducted in a successful and peaceful manner. We also hope that the agreement reached between the leadership of the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states on the 30% quota for women will be upheld. We welcome in this regard the endorsement by the federal government of the Somali Women's Charter, which set a 50% women representation target. We also welcome the formation by the federal government of Somalia of a technical committee to prepare a roadmap for one person, one vote universal elections in 2024-2025 and encourage thorough consultations with the federal member states and other stakeholders for its rapid adoption. On the security situation, the A3+1 remains deeply concerned about the volatile security situation in Somalia. We strongly condemn the latest terrorist attacks perpetrated by Al-Shabaab and express our sincere condolences to the families of the victims and to the Somali people and government. We also profoundly regret the loss of civilian lives and pay tribute to the ultimate sacrifice made by AMISOM and Somali security forces personnel in the fight against terrorism. The A3+1 shares the view that Al-Shabaab remains the most immediate threat to the stability and security of Somalia, having evolved over the years from a primarily military threat to the survival of the Somali state to a terrorist hybrid and asymmetric threat. We also agree that despite the progress achieved so far, Somalia still needs international support to fight against Al-Shabaab and to help build state capacity until it is able to take full responsibility of its own security. In particular, given the hybrid terrorist threat posed by Al-Shabaab, increased resources should be devoted to developing and enhancing capabilities such as counter-IED, counter-terrorism intelligence, and counter-terrorism operations. The A3+1 further believes that Al-Shabaab cannot be defeated solely by military means. More efforts should be made to diminish Al-Shabaab's access to finance, tackle its ability to recruit and radicalize, and counter its extremist propaganda. The promotion of the rule of law, justice and human rights, state building, governance, economic developments, institutional capacity building, and the extension of state authority through inclusive politics and reconciliation are also necessary for the eventual permanent defeat of Al-Shabaab. In this regard, the A3+1 encourages the federal government of Somalia to expedite the finalization of the revised Somali transition plan as a Somali-owned and led inclusive process between the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states, and looks forward to its consideration and endorsement by the Peace and Security Council as the basis for the African Union continued commitment and contribution to the peace and security of Somalia with the support of international partners. Madam President, while renewing our appreciation for the sustained contributions of the United Nations and of the international partners to bringing peace, security, and stability in Somalia, we would like to focus more specifically as the A3+1 on the role of AMISOM and Somali security forces. We note that the independent assessment of international support to the whole security environment in Somalia post-2021 that was submitted to the Council by the Secretary General in January 2021 concluded that a reconfigured AMISOM is the most viable option for providing an international security operation capable of protecting the Somali state and international partners, disrupting Al-Shabaab and other threats, and operating in support of the Somali security forces. Confirming that the A3+1 and the African Union have been stating for a long time now, the independent assessment underscored that AMISOM is underfunded compared to similar-sized UN stabilization operations, and that the continuation of the UN support package via UN ANSOS and additional support via the European Union and other willing donors and the AMISOM Trust Fund should be a minimum prerequisite. It added that the optimal solution would be UN-assessed contribution funding for a reconfigured AMISOM. The report also pointed to a sense of unfairness due to the fact that the African troops deployed to AMISOM receive only 70% of the stipends of those deployed in UN peacekeeping operations where they face considerably less risk. It concluded that the current situation undermines the moral and effectiveness of the mission. Madam President, the African Union Peace and Security Council, in its communique of February 9, 2021, welcomed the envisaged configuration of AMISOM in collaboration with the Somali security forces. It urged the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states to expedite the force generation processes to enhance Somali security forces capabilities to the required levels that will enable AMISOM's reconfiguration to be completed to adequately support the key priorities of the Somali transition plan. At the same time, the Peace and Security Council appealed to the international community and in particular the UN Security Council to avail the space necessary for the federal government of Somalia in close collaboration with the African Union to lead the discussions concerning the international engagement with Somalia post-2021, in line with the Somali transition plan. The A3+1 believes that the Security Council should heed this appeal from the African Union and refrain from pronouncing on any possible arrangements beyond 2021 until the finalization of the African Union-led independent assessment expected in May 2021. Accordingly, the A3+1 is ready to support the proposed 10-month renewal of the AMISOM authorization only on the understanding that no change to the mandate of the mission or the current troop sailing would be made for the time being. On the promotion of human rights and humanitarian situation, we welcome the efforts made by the government of Somalia to promote the justice system and fight corruption through the establishment of the Judicial Service Commission and the Anti-Corruption Commission, and we encourage it to take the necessary steps to further promote and protect human rights, in particular women and girls' rights, freedom of speech, and access to information. We strongly condemn reported incidents of civilian casualties, conflict-related sexual violence, which continues to disproportionately affect women and girls, grave violations against children, including abduction, recruitment, and youth killing and maiming, that have been registered during the period under review. We reiterate that more effective measures must be taken to prevent these violations consistent with international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We underline the importance of identifying and holding accountable the perpetrators of these crimes. Madam President, the humanitarian situation in Somalia remains deeply concerning. The interconnecting challenges of the coronavirus pandemic, devastating floods and other hazards of climate change, and the desert locust infestation have resulted in increased displacements and people in need of humanitarian assistance. The rise in acute food insecurity and malnourishment, including amongst children, is particularly troubling. With 5.9 million people projected to require humanitarian assistance in 2021, we call on international partners to scale up funding in order to support the humanitarian response plans and alleviate the suffering of the Somali people. We regret that the security situation remains a major constraint to humanitarian operations, and we strongly condemn the continued violent incidents against humanitarian operations and providers. We commend AMISOM for its humanitarian assistance efforts, including its assistance to health workers in context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions it imposes on population movements in Somalia. We call for additional international dedicated support, including funding and required resources to enable AMISOM to more effectively support humanitarian efforts in all its sectors. To conclude, Madam President, the A3+1 would like to reiterate its appreciation for the continued efforts of the UN, the African Union, the European Union, IGAD, and all the international partners in support of a Somali-led and Somali-owned security, reconciliation, and peace building. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement on behalf of the A3+1. I now give the floor to Ireland. You have the floor.
at the outset, Madam, to express the death of the Electoral in Niger, and I also to Italy following the accident in your seeking lives of 3, including the ambassador of Italy. We unreservedly condemn the brutality of these attacks. Madam President, I want to also thank our excellent briefers this morning and to welcome Minister Abdirizak back amongst us today. Madam President, we have heard that Somalia stands at a critical juncture. We had hoped that at today's meeting, we would have been able to congratulate Somalia on successful elections. Instead, the constitutional term of the President of Somalia has ended without agreement on an inclusive political arrangement for electoral process, which would ensure a peaceful and political transition. We sincerely regret this. We're further disappointed that despite statements made on the 9th of February 2021, the leaders of the federal government of Somalia and federal member states have yet to come together to resolve the outstanding electoral implementation issues. Madam President, the truth is that the longer this political stalemate continues, the further Somalia moves into a state of political uncertainty. In the week when we're due to renew AMISOM's mandate, the significant gains made in fighting al-Shabaab are now under threat. The streets of Mogadishu in the past few days rang with the sound of heavy weaponry, fired not against al-Shabaab, but in pursuit of political advantage. We saw the FGS deploy security forces against demonstrators. Minister, I see he's gone off the screen again. I believe you're with us, Minister Abdirizak. I wanted to say to you that I know you agree with us that this violence is unacceptable. The peace, security, and the stability of your country. It puts civilians at risk. I urge the leaders of Somalia to put the interests of their people first and immediately re-engage in constructive dialogue. I can do no better than reiterate the words of the chairperson of the African Union Commission. The stability of Somalia is at stake. There is a need for dialogue and compromise. As trust between the parties has further diminished in the wake of the violence in Mogadishu, we see the role of the African Union as critical to convening the parties and finding consensus model agreed on 17 September 2020. The sustainability of Somalia's political future depends on being inclusive. Ireland continues to call for a credible and inclusive electoral process that safeguards freedom of expression and ultimately best serves the national interest. Let me stress in particular, Madam President, that despite the stressful conditions today in Somalia, frankly, maybe because of them, I once again reiterate the importance of following through on the implementation of the 30% women's quota throughout this entire process. Madam President, AMISOM and Somali National Security Forces risk their lives every day in the line of duty. Too frequently, as we've seen, they pay the ultimate price. We welcome the successes in reducing the number of vehicle-borne IEDs, which was the result of increased effectiveness of security operations. Equally, the disruption of supply chains and the enforcement of the arms embargo are key in countering IEDs. However, there are still, as we know, far too many people dying in the hands of al-Shabaab and others in attacks such as the one on the Afrique Hotel on the 31st of January. We condemn these in the strongest possible terms. To move beyond this context, we need to see sustained momentum on Somalia's security transition. There is broad agreement, including around this council table, on one thing for sure, that we need a phased handover of primary security responsibilities by AMISOM to the Somali authorities. This will involve adapting our collective approach to countering the asymmetric threat of al-Shabaab including through the use of non-military means, such as financial disruption. It also means addressing the governance and justice gaps which have created space for al-Shabaab to continue to extend its reach, including to areas not formally under its control. The way forward for Somalia's security transition is complex but clear. It involves cooperation between all stakeholders and taking into account the realities on the ground. In this week's renewal of the AMISOM mandate, the Security Council must lay out the path and the milestones towards this transition. This should include enhanced federal government and federal member state cooperation, agreement on implementation of the Somali transition plan, and completion of the African Union independent assessment and progress on forced, among others. None of this, however, will be possible without political consensus on a way forward for Somalia, a consensus that addresses underlying divisions in Somali society and puts an end to political leveraging of Somalia's security personnel and resources. We all have the same goal, that's a safer Somalia for all Somalis. We must work together to achieve this. Madam President, human rights remain central in our collective consideration of next steps, as must the protection of civilians. Reports of a rise in conflict-related sexual violence, alongside attempts to introduce the regressive Sexual Intercourse and Related Crimes Bill, are of particular concern. Protecting women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence surely has to be a priority. I joined the Secretary General in calling for the federal government to enact the 2018 Sexual Offences Bill and to ensure accountability for perpetrators of sexual violence. The use of arbitrary arrest and detention, including of journalists, remains a concern. Finally, Madam President, as we heard earlier from Special Representative James Swan, Somalia is facing into complex and multifaceted humanitarian challenges on the ground, looming from drought, ongoing COVID threat, and desert locusts. The Secretary General's own report shows the number of people growing in terms of need in Somalia, now at 5.9 million people. We all have a responsibility to do what we can to assist. However, and I say this with our friend, the Somali Foreign Minister with us, the Somali leadership must also recognise that the time spent arguing about election modalities and the use of armed violence is time and resources lost to protecting the lives and livelihoods of Somalis, and a drag on building the much-needed prosperity and security of Somalia. I therefore call again on all parties to quickly find consensus on the holding of inclusive elections so that we can collectively focus firmly back where it belongs, ensuring the safety, security and health of every Somali citizen. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China. You have the floor.
Madam President, I wish to thank Mr. Swan, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General, and Mr. Madeira, Special Representative of the Chairperson of the AU Commission, and Ms. Lahar Jinha, Managing Director of the European External Action Service for their briefings, and welcome the Foreign Minister of Somalia for his presence at today's meeting. The current situation in Somalia is at a critical juncture. The parties in Somalia have continued to negotiate regarding the elections, while the international community is actively preparing for the security transition in Somalia. At the same time, the security and humanitarian situation in Somalia remains very fragile. China strongly condemns the recent multiple violent terrorist attacks in Somalia and expresses deep condolences to the victims. Here, I would like to highlight the following 3 points. First, no effort can be spared to maintain political stability in Somalia. Though the parties in Somalia have recently tried to maintain the momentum of dialogue on the elections, relevant differences have been dragged on without a solution for a long time, which not only hinders efforts to rebuild the country, but also leads to political instability and even deterioration of the security situation. China is concerned over the recent violent incidents in Mogadishu. We call on all parties in Somalia to exercise restraint, maintain dialogue, show flexibility, and find a proper solution to end the political deadlock as soon as possible, so that the elections can be held sooner to restore political stability in Somalia and to create a favorable environment for focusing their efforts on national construction to avoid a reversal of earlier gains. Second, the security situation in Somalia needs continuous improvement. Somalia will need to rely on itself to achieve peace and stability in the country. After all, the international community has already reached a consensus on the gradual assumption by Somalia of its security responsibilities, while affirming that AMISOM remains indispensable under the current situation. All parties should follow the principle of a Somali-led and Somali-owned solution to reach an agreement on a steady and orderly transfer of security responsibilities. AMISOM is an African Union peacekeeping operation authorized by the Security Council. A strong partnership is essential to the success of AMISOM. The roles of the United Nations, the African Union, the troop contributing countries, and the role of the host country are all indispensable. China supports the parties in strengthening communication on the renewal of AMISOM to find a solution acceptable to all. Third, we need to help Somalia cope with humanitarian and development challenges. The compound effects of COVID-19 floods and locust infestation have exacerbated the humanitarian situation in Somalia. About 1/3 of its population is in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. The international community should scale up its assistance to ameliorate the difficult situation of the people of Somalia, will also actively help Somalia develop its economy to improve people's livelihood. China welcomes the efforts of the Somali government to meet the completion point requirements to achieve debt relief for heavily indebted poor countries, and expects the international community to provide a more lenient environment for the development of Somalia. China has always been engaged in helping Somalia achieve peace and development. We have recently donated multiple batches of supplies to Somalia to support the country in strengthening its judicial capacity building. We will also provide COVID-19 vaccine assistance to Somalia upon request. China will continue to work with the international community to make contributions within its capacity to peace and reconstruction in Somalia. Thank you, Madam President.
To the representative of the Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Madam President, we thank the Special Representative of the Secretary-General, James Swan, the Special Representative of the African Union and AMISOM, Francisco Madeira, and the Representative of the European Union, Rita Larangina, for their informative briefings. We welcome the participation in today's meeting of the Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Mr. Mohamed Abdirazak. We've closely read the latest Secretary-General's report. The Russian Federation supports the efforts of the federal government of Somalia to resolve the political crisis in the country and to continue dialogue with the federal states to move to holding elections at national level soon. In recent months, Mogadishu has carried out significant work to agree the ways of implementing the electoral model that was approved on the 17th of September last year. We welcome the rapprochement between the federal authorities and the regions achieved at the beginning of this month during a meeting in Dosamareb, and also thanks to the work of the technical committee. We note the constant readiness of dialogue demonstrated in Mogadishu. There is a need to further develop this process at the negotiating table. We should bear in mind that ultimata, a lack of a constructive approach, or internecine conflict could strengthen those forces working against unity within the country. The use of violence is unacceptable. We condemn the recent flare of conflict in Mogadishu on the 19th of February. We encourage all parties in the Somali political process to refrain from any unilateral measures and to put the interests of the country and its population above party interests. All political forces within the country should come together and demonstrate the necessary will to maintain peace and stability in Somalia. We think that any international assistance for the electoral process should unswervingly comply with the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Somalia, and not meddle in the domestic affairs of the country. Mr. Swan, we hope that you will continue your role as honest broker in the process. Against the background of the political crisis, we've seen an increase in terrorist activity from Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group. It's aiming to consolidate its position while the authorities' attention is diverted by preparations for the elections. We call on Somalia and peacekeepers not to reduce their efforts in their fight against extremists. Madam President, as previously, we believe that the African peacekeeping missions remain a key instrument in guaranteeing security in the country. We welcome the federal government's results as achieved recently in the process of transfer of responsibility for security from AMISOM. We look forward to the necessary decisions also being taken by the African Union. At the end of this month, we expect to see the AMISOM mandate rolled over, and we think that then it's important to take into account Mogadishu's position and also the work of regional players directly involved in maintaining peace and security in the country. On the whole, we are convinced that any decision on African peacekeepers should be taken considering the interests of Mogadishu and also the progress towards the Somali National Army and also the building of a unified national security architecture. Any attempts to speed up the drawdown of AMISOM we think are unacceptable. In conclusion, Madam President, we wish to underscore Russia's firm commitment to effective work within the UN Security Council to resolve the current political crisis in Somalia. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
La Fédération de Russie. Je donne la parole à la France. 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 Excusez-moi, j'ai un petit problème avec Interprefy. Madame la Présidente.
Seem to be an Interprefy problem. President, dear colleagues, I wish to begin my statement like my Irish colleague by indicating that France condemns most strongly the violence that has taken place in the east of the DRC. And we extend our condolences to the victims and their families. Madam President, dear colleagues, I thank today's speakers for their briefings and their comprehensive information provided. We condemn the violence that has been taking since February 18th in Mogadishu. These clashes are taking place in a context of political deadlock, lack of a prospective date for the elections, and these elections were to lead to the appointment of a new parliament and president by this past February 8th, and they remain essential for the legitimacy of Somalian institutions. We therefore call on all parties to exercise restraint as violence carries the potential risk of clan-related conflict and plays into the hand of terrorists. The international community cannot allow our common efforts to combat al-Shabaab and achieve the consolidation of the Somalian state to be hindered. It is therefore important to overcome this current political impasse as soon as possible. In that connection, we take note of the technical agreement of February 16th on organizing the elections. It is the first step in the right direction. We call on the federal Somalian government and the member states to conclude a political agreement so that elections can take place across the country in all the states quickly and on the basis of consensus. The long-term existence of the federation is at stake. Recall the importance of the inclusivity of the electoral process. The full participation of women must be ensured as voters and candidates, including the 30% quota in Parliament. We also call for the participation of youth in accordance with Resolution 2535 on the Youth, Peace and Security agenda. Intra-Somalian discussion should allow to strengthen the rule of law and consolidate democracy in Somalia with the support of the UN and SRSG Swan, whose work I commend. The adoption of the constitutional amendments is equally crucial for building peace. France remains gravely concerned by the humanitarian situation in Somalia. We express our support to the civilian populations whose plight has been further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and extreme climate conditions, be it the desert locust infestation or the consequences of climate change. We call for ensuring unimpeded and safe humanitarian aspect and condemn attacks on humanitarian and health personnel, as well as obstacles to provision of humanitarian aspects. These crimes will not remain unpunished. Respect for IHL and international human rights law is non-negotiable. We're also concerned by the increase in violence against children, and we call for the full implementation of the conclusions of the Working Group on Children in Armed Conflict adopted in August. We reiterate our concern over the draft law on the protection of children, which is currently being studied, which is not in line with international and regional legal instruments to which Somalia is a party, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Finally, Madam President, I recall that 2020 is to be the year of security transition as stipulated in Security Council Resolutions 2520 and 2540. We take note of the transition plan that has been transmitted to the Council by Somalia, and we welcome the independent assessment carried out by General Dos Santos Cruz and his team. We support the conclusions according to which AMISOM should progressively hand over functions to Somalian armed forces. France believes that a decision must be taken this year on the role and financing of AMISOM, and this will require constructive discussion with the participation of all, first and foremost the African Union and its Peace and Security Council, but also Somalia, TCCs, and financial backers. In this connection, I recall the EU's commitment, which has contributed more than $1.94 billion since 2007. It is essential for other countries to support this mission financially as well, and France stands ready to contribute to the success of that discussion.
For her statement, I now give the floor to the representative of the United States. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Special Representative Swan, for your summary of the latest developments in Somalia. The United States also greatly appreciates the comments and the analysis from the other briefers this morning. As many of the speakers before me have said, we meet here today at a critical time for Somalia as the country both approaches an imminent political transition that will determine the country's leadership for the next 4 years, and as the country prepares for a security transition that will begin to take shape starting next year. Our remarks on Somalia over the past several months in this council have focused on the need for Somalia's leadership to seize the opportunity before them and make concerted efforts to advance peace and security for Somalia's people. This is now clearly most urgent and most apparent with respect to the lack of an agreed way forward on national elections. Uncertainty over the elections has stymied the national dialogue on critical political, economic, and security reforms. The eruption of political violence on the streets of Mogadishu last week is the latest indication that if not resolved soon, Somalia risks regressing deeper into instability. The United States firmly opposes the use of violence by any party. We call on President Farmajo and Somalia's federal member state leaders to act swiftly to resolve the political impasse that threatens Somalia's future and to find agreement to allow the conduct of parliamentary and presidential elections immediately. The February 16th Technical Committee recommendations provide a clear framework for resolving the impasse. We urge all political leaders to endorse the recommendations and begin implementation as a matter of urgency. Let me be clear, partial, parallel, or alternative election processes, including prolonged interim governing arrangements, would only further increase prospects for instability and be a major setback for Somalia. A timely and peaceful political transition and renewed commitment between the federal government and federal member states to work together are needed for Somalia to adequately address the many tasks it faces. Fighting al-Shabaab remains an urgent priority, as we have heard. Later this week, this council will consider again extending the mandate of the AMISOM mission, which has been vital to the progress Somalia has achieved over the past decade. But lasting stability requires Somali forces capable of providing for their own security. We welcome the updated Somalia transition plan and see it as a step towards the transfer of security responsibilities from AMISOM. It will be imperative that the federal government devote the political and financial resources necessary for its successful implementation. In addition to developing security forces that can take the fight to terrorists, more must be done to cut off the resources these groups use to fund their deadly attacks. We look forward to continuing to support Somali authorities' efforts to expand their own counter-terrorist financing authorities and capabilities. The United States remains focused on limiting the ability of al-Shabaab to conduct attacks against civilians and is committed to partnering with member states to utilize the 751 Somalia sanctions regime to its fullest extent. To this end, we are proud to note that today we joined with the federal government of Somalia in co-nominating 3 senior al-Shabaab leaders, Abukar Ali Ayadan, Malib Ayman, and Mahad Kati, to the 751 Somalia sanctions list. These designations demonstrate that the international community will hold accountable those who undermine Somalia's peace, security, and stability. We welcome co-sponsorships, which would serve as an expression of the Security Council's unity in condemning al-Shabaab and its violence. Consistent and united support from Somalia's neighbors and other international partners for reform and stabilization remains imperative. It is incumbent on all of us, Madam President, to remain focused on Somalia's stabilization and to avoid the pursuit of narrow interests that work counter to this long-term strategic goal. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mexico. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Very much, Madam President. Mexico would like to firmly condemn the attack in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and our condolences are extended to the families of the victims. We'd like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, James Swan, and Special Representative of the African Union, José Madeira, for their reports on the situation in Somalia, particularly with regard to the most recent events, with regard to the political process, with regard to elections, and also with regard to the general security challenges. We're also grateful to the Managing Director, Rita Larrañaga, and we'd like to welcome to this meeting the Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Somalia. Mexico regrets that it has not been possible to achieve an agreement to deal with the political and electoral stalemate at the recent meeting of leaders in Dusa Mareb, and that it was also not possible to hold the meeting that was initially planned in Mogadishu. Nevertheless, it's good to know that other high-level contacts have provided results and agreements on certain controversial matters. We would call upon all political leaders to continue along the path of dialogue in order to resolve their outstanding differences. It's essential to avoid violent actions which could endanger a possible agreement or indeed endanger the very stability of the country. The permanent threat of al-Shabaab, together with the uncontrolled flows of arms into Somali territory, is a lethal combination. The consequences of this are paid for by innocent civilians. Mexico calls upon the Somali authorities to apply effective controls to weapons transfers and to ensure the effectiveness of the embargo. Without an effective plan to control the scourge of these unrestricted flows, we will not see an end to this humanitarian tragedy. Certainly, we welcome the recent publication of the transition plan, which details the vision of the Somali government to gradually take over responsibilities in the area of security and coordination, security in coordination with the international community, including the United Nations and the African Union. But at the same time, we condemn the deplorable rate of sexual and gender-based violence referred to by the Secretary-General in his report. It is essential that those responsible be punished and not the victims. Their damages should be compensated in accordance with regional standards and international law. Moreover, we reaffirm the importance of ensuring that as a minimum 30% of seats are assigned to women in the composition of the electoral committees during the upcoming elections. We are also concerned by the incidents of kidnappings, assassination and mutilation of girls and boys, very many of them attributed to the federal armed forces. Mexico calls upon all parties to prevent and put an immediate end to such actions and to meet their obligations in accordance with international law. In particular, we would call upon the government to speed up the implementation of action plans to stop the killing and mutilation of children, as well as address the various conclusions of the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict. Madam President, the humanitarian situation has become even more complex due to a second wave of COVID-19 cases, the desert locust infestation, and the impacts of floods and droughts. Climate change is clearly a factor which has exacerbated the conflict in Somalia and contributes to food insecurity. According to the last joint technical assessment of the FAO and the Early Warning Systems Network Against Famine, more than 2.6 million people in Somalia are in a situation of extreme food insecurity, and unfortunately, it is predicted that this situation is going to get worse. It is therefore urgent that we take effective measures that address all of these variables in order to alleviate the humanitarian situation and prevent the reoccurrence of these adverse circumstances. Finally, and with regard to the renewal of the mandate of AMISOM, Mexico believes that although it is the African Union which has a role of authority and authorship over the future composition and functions, it is the Security Council which has particular responsibility to effectively manage the interaction between this mission and AMISOM, as well as in the broader context of security and capacity building in Somalia. We hope that this renewal will make it possible to achieve these synergies, the primary aim of which is the security and the stability of Somalia. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I join others in thanking the briefers for their insightful overviews. Foreign Minister of Somalia to today's discussion. Estonia is very concerned about the deteriorating security situation and strongly condemns the violence that has taken place in Mogadishu. I call on all parties to exercise restraint and calm, as violence will only exacerbate the existing problems. It will only feed the growing grievances of Somali people, as well as open opportunities for terrorist groups and spoilers to exploit. The recent spike in Al-Shabaab activity is a stark reminder of how there is no room for error to let the political impasse to derail the progress we must continue to make. Therefore, it is crucial for the Somali leaders to urgently come together and put the interests of the Somali people first. The leaders need to arrive at a broadly accepted understanding within the framework of the 17th of September agreement and hold the elections without further delays. I welcome the 16th of February agreement of the Technical Committee as a step in the right direction and call on the leaders to act on it. Holding peaceful and inclusive elections is also important to renew the legitimacy of the Somali federal institutions. This is necessary not only to safeguard immediate stability in the country, but also for building long-term sustainable peace in Somalia. In the upcoming elections, Estonia urges Somali authorities to implement a 30% female quota and ensure marginalized groups, including youth, are included. I also call to protect freedom of expression and the press. Additionally, Estonia underlines the need to put in place measures and institutions to protect human rights. I reiterate the call to establish the Independent National Human Rights Commission, which has a key role to play in promoting and protecting human rights. The high level of conflict-related sexual violence remains very concerning. It is crucial to hold the perpetrators of sexual violence accountable. Therefore, I urge the federal government to take steps to protect women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence by enacting the 2018 Sexual Offence Bill. Estonia also calls for the full implementation of conclusions of the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict on Somalia. In order to ensure that Somalia is making progress in its democratization process, I strongly support the development of an agreed pathway to one person, one vote elections in 2024-25. On this note, I would also highly support institutionalization of regular consultations between the federal government and the federal member states so that they could be making progress on a number of state-building priorities. Estonia is encouraged by the recent progress towards the security transition in Somalia, and we welcome the independent assessment and as well as the updated Somali transition plan. This momentum must continue to build the stepping stones necessary for Somalia to take full responsibility for its security by the end of 2023, as set out in the updated Somali transition plan. However, for this to happen, serious work and planning must commence already now. This includes holding the fourth generation conference and renewing AMISOM's mandate to reflect the evolved situation on the ground. I would also like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the commitment and sacrifice of AMISOM forces in Somalia and alongside courageous Somali forces to defeat Al-Shabaab. Estonia is deeply concerned about the dire humanitarian situation, especially about the projection that the humanitarian situation is set to worsen this year. According to the recent recently issued humanitarian response plan, $1.09 billion is required in 2021. I call on international community to provide the necessary funding to save lives in Somalia. In conclusion, the coming months will be crucial for Somalia, and allow me to reiterate Estonia's full support for the country and its people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of India. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank SRSG James Swan, head of the AMISOM, Francisco Madeira, and Ms. Rita Larencina of the European External Action Service for their briefings on the recent developments in Somalia. I also welcome His Excellency the Foreign Minister of Somalia. Before I begin, I would like to join others in extending our condolences to the families of the victims of the suicide bombing near the Parliament building and the Presidential Palace in Mogadishu a week ago, and also the lives that were lost during the clashes last week. Madam President, being a member of the Security Council during the early years of its being seized of the situation in Somalia almost 3 decades ago, and having played an important role earlier in the UN mission in the country, India is aware of the efforts that the Council has put in over the years for securing lasting peace and stability in Somalia. During the last decade, thanks to the security provided by AMISOM and the critical roles played by the AU and UNSOM, Somalia has made steady progress towards national reconciliation and state building, despite several shortcomings and setbacks. Today, Somalia is yet again facing a political deadlock, which is threatening the progress achieved in recent years towards attaining stabilization. The political impasse over the holding of elections is indeed disappointing. It has been more than 5 months since the signing of the agreement on September 17th last year. Contrary to our expectations, the meeting between the leaders of the federal member states and the federal government of Somalia, planned at first for 15th of February and then 19 February, did not take place. It is important that Somali leaders engage in constructive dialogue to resolve the issues that are delaying the holding of elections. We welcome the 16th February announcement that the technical committee representing the federal government and the federal member states identified solutions to outstanding electoral issues, and that these have been submitted to the National Consultative Council. We now expect an early decision of the leaders towards holding of elections soon. We also urge all Somalis not to resort to violence during this important transition and to encourage dialogue and reconciliation with full involvement of women in the electoral process as well. There is little doubt that the longer it takes to hold elections, the more complicated the situation will become. The delay will only embolden Al-Shabaab and other armed groups to gain more ground and continue their terror acts, subverting the democratic gains made so far. The frequency of terror acts perpetrated by Al-Shabaab over the last few months is a matter of serious concern. Last week's suicide bombing in Mogadishu reflects the fragile security situation in the country. We strongly condemn these terror attacks. We are also concerned at the increased use of IEDs by Al-Shabaab and call for extending support to Somali security forces in building their capacity to tackle this menace. Madam President, AMISOM has been playing a key role in containing Al-Shabaab in Somalia for several years now. AMISOM remains the rallying point of the international community's efforts for stabilization of the security situation in the country. We commend all AMISOM troop and police contributing countries for their commitment and for the sacrifices they have made. We have taken note of the recommendations made in the Secretary General's independent assessment report in January this year. We are also encouraged by the priorities and guideposts laid down in the revised Somali transition plan. However, Somali security forces and institutions need continued support to tackle Al-Shabaab and other armed groups. We believe that the transition of security responsibilities from AMISOM to Somali security forces should be carefully calibrated, keeping in mind the ground realities. A hasty withdrawal will nullify the progress achieved so far. We also believe that the extension of AMISOM mandate should not be limited by the current constraints of funding. The views of the AU and the countries in the region form critical inputs for Council's action on AMISOM mandate renewal. In this regard, the points mentioned in the 9th February 2021 communique of the African Union Peace and Security Council deserve careful consideration of this council. We believe that an extension of AMISOM mandate could allow all stakeholders to look into the reconfiguration of AMISOM in a comprehensive manner at a later date. Madam President, we are deeply concerned at the exacerbating humanitarian situation in Somalia. Sustained conflict and economic instability have been compounded by the triple threat of COVID-19, desert locusts, and floods. It is reprehensible that humanitarian workers working under such difficult circumstances are being targeted by Al-Shabaab and its affiliated groups. Access for humanitarian workers remains critical for alleviating the challenges faced by the Somali people. It is equally important to assist Somalia in fighting the desert locusts, which spread from that region to many parts of Asia, causing extensive damage to crops. This aspect should also be given special attention by the international community. On the piracy front, while there have been no successful piracy attacks off the coast of Somalia recently, the threat has persisted. India has been engaged in combating piracy and ensuring maritime security and safe navigation in the region. The Indian Navy has been conducting anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden and off the coast of Somalia continuously since October 2008 and has coordinated with multinational partners to contribute to maritime security and safety for all in the region. The situation in Somalia calls for sustained engagement with the federal government and the federal member states to comprehensively address the multitude of problems in political, security, and humanitarian fields. We acknowledge and extend our support to the efforts of the AU, IGAD, and the UN in bringing political stability to Somalia and to the Horn of Africa. Madam President, India's association with Somalia goes back centuries. India made a significant contribution to peacekeeping in Somalia through its significant involvement in UNSOM II during 1993-94. 12 Indian soldiers laid down their lives for keeping peace in Somalia. India has supported AMISOM in the past and will continue to do so. In recent years, India has extended its support for capacity building in Somalia. We have supplied essential medicines to the country. And earlier this month, we gifted buses to the Somali Transport Ministry to augment public transportation facilities. India remains committed to assist Somalia on its path towards sustained peace and stability. I thank you, Madam President.
I think we've lost the sound from the representative of India.
He concluded his statement, Madam President.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. And I first want to welcome His Excellency Mohammed Adirizak Mohamud, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Somalia, to our meeting today. I would like to thank SISG Swan, Mr. Madeira, and Ms. Laranjia for their informative briefing and for their work on the ground at this very challenging time. Madam President, the 17th September 2020 agreement on the national electoral process was a remarkable achievement in Somalia. While we acknowledge several positive developments that have been achieved, as well as the advances that have been generated by the agreement, it is regrettable that we have yet to see its full implementation so far. Only through continued dialogue in a spirit of unity and cooperation can Somalia tackle the political, security, and humanitarian challenges. Therefore, we continue to call on all relevant parties to redouble their efforts in delivering on their commitment. With regard to the matter under discussion today, I would like to share the following point. First, on national unity. We follow closely the ongoing situation in Somalia, and we are deeply concerned about the heavy gunfire and clashes last Friday between the opposition and security forces. Somalians are longing for peace, stability, and development in their country, and it's time to listen to their legitimate aspiration now. We therefore call on all relevant parties to refrain from all acts that might plunge the Somalia into chaos and jeopardize peace and security in the country. We would like also to stress the importance of national unity and reconciliation for Somalia on the way forward. Second, on the election process, we commend efforts undertaken by the leader of the federal government of Somalia, FGS, and the federal member states, MMS, in dialogue on the agreed electoral process. We, however, regret that the recent talks between the FGS and MMS have failed to reach consensus on outstanding issues. In this connection, we call on the FGS and MMS and political parties to set aside differences and to make further effort to engage in inclusive dialogue to reach political consensus on the implementation of the September 17 electoral model, with the modality and timing of the election acceptable to all Somali stakeholders, which includes 30% of the political representation of women and minority. We also call on the United Nations and the international community to increase financial and technical assistance for Somalian government to achieve this goal. Third, on resilience for security. We strongly condemn the violence and recent terrorist attacks, including those using IED and high-profile suicide attacks against civilians, government officers, as well as Somali National Army, SNI, and AMISOM forces. The perpetrators of those violent acts must be brought to justice. And we welcome the transition of the security responsibility to the ownership of Somalia. We support the operation carried out by the Somalia security forces, AMISOM, and international partners against Al-Shabaab. In this regard, we call upon international partners to maintain their support for Somalia security forces through training, equipment provision, and capacity building. Last but not least, on socio-economic development. The number of long-standing threats and challenges, including desert holocaust, floods, and the COVID-19 pandemic, have caused negative impact on the segment of population who was already vulnerable due to the chronic poverty and conflict. The risks of exponential infection by the COVID-19 also remain high across the country. In this connection, we call on international partners to assist FGS in alleviating the socio-economic impact caused by these threats. We cannot emphasize enough the need to address deep-rooted economic issues facing Somalia, especially in agriculture development. Only with such assistance can the government and the people of Somalia overcome long-term challenges and strive for a sustained stability and security. Before conclusion, we would like to commend the unceasing works and untiring efforts of the UNSOS, AMISOM, and UN country teams in Somalia. We would also like to reiterate our full support for promoting peace, stability, and development in the country. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Let me first start by condemning the latest attacks in DRC. And let me also thank the briefer at today's meeting. A special thanks to the SRSG Swan and SRCC Madeira for their joint efforts to facilitate solutions to the current political and electoral crisis in Somalia. Speaking with one voice sends a strong message of the multilateral system, committed and ready to support Somalia's efforts moving forward. We also welcome the presence of the Somali Foreign Minister. The federal government, federal member states, and other stakeholders should work together and redouble their efforts to reach a consensual solution without delay. This crisis has already consumed too much political energy that could have been put to a better use. Advancing social changes, economic development, and not least security. We welcome statement made over the weekend by the AU, IGAD, and the UN, and encourage even more assertive and coordinated efforts by these actors, including through active facilitation of talks. President, with reference to the current developments, as highlighted in the report, let me focus 4 key priorities. First, the Somali Women Charter provides a solid Somali-led and owned foundation towards more broad-based and inclusive processes in all reform areas. We strongly believe that supporting the inclusion and empowerment of Somali women should be given higher priority and visibility by the Somali government, as well as in the mandate and work of AMISOM and the UN. It is positive that the electoral law that was passed in February 2020 stipulates a 30% quota for women in the federal parliament. However, there is a need for a real political will to ensure that such a quota is implementable, and for the Somali political leadership to see women's increased political participation as beneficial to the further development and state building in the country. Second, the updated Somali transition plan is of key importance to the process towards Somali taking responsibility for its own security. A comprehensive approach to security includes effective and coordinated stabilization efforts, as well as addressing root causes through the national reconciliation process. We would like to underscore the importance of a close cooperation and partnership between the AU and UN in order to facilitate a coherent and coordinated international support to the implementation of the STP. A recent study of the AMISOM, Somali Army and civilian partners' intervention in Lower Sahel highlighted improved cooperation among partners as one of the success factors. Third, we support Somali's effort to ensure that revisions of the Provisional Federal Constitution and other legislation are in line with Somalia's international human rights obligations. We strongly urge the federal government of Somalia, FGS, to ensure that any bill addressing current gaps in the legal framework on sexual violence is in line with regional and international obligations, and call for the immediate reintroduction of the 2018 Sexual Offences Bill. We also call on the FGS to enact the widely consulted version of the Child Rights Bill. Fourth, Somalia is highly susceptible to the effects of climate change and extreme weather. It impacts livelihood, increases displacement, and can fuel tensions and disrupt ongoing conflict resolution initiatives. In addressing the recurrent humanitarian crisis in Somalia, we need to strengthen our partnership with the Somali government in addressing these crises and climate-related security risks through advancing the humanitarian development peace nexus. President, going forward, the country will depend on courageous women and men who seek solutions through dialogue and compromise. Norway remains committed a committed partner with the Somali people, and are ready to continue our support to Somali-led and Somali-owned reforms to secure peace, inclusive democracy and development to the people of Somalia. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd first like to express on behalf of the United Kingdom our condolences to the government of Italy and to the World Food Programme following the attack on a World Food Programme convoy in the Democratic Republic of Congo earlier today, which resulted in the deaths of 3 people, including the Italian ambassador. Our thoughts are with their families and those who were injured. Turning to the subject of Somalia, I'd like to start by thanking our briefers today. The UK strongly condemns the terror attacks launched by al-Shabaab in Mogadishu in recent weeks. These incidents have increased as the prospect of national elections draws closer, a clear attempt to destabilise and disrupt the process. We express our condolences to the families of victims and stand in solidarity with Somalia in their fight against terrorism. The UK welcomes the agreement reached by the Technical Committee on the 16th of February on the implementation of the electoral process, in line with the 17 September agreement between the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states. This is the only legitimate basis for elections. We're concerned by the violent clashes in Mogadishu on the 19th of February. Somalia's leaders must arrive at consensus on the implementation of the electoral process without delay. That requires all parties to demonstrate flexibility. It is vital that inclusive national elections can take place as soon as possible. Any alternative outcomes, including partial elections or any unilateral actions that lack broad agreement, will not receive support from the international community and risk further violence and instability. Timely delivery of the electoral process would also allow Somalia's leaders to refocus on critical issues that require urgent attention, such as the ongoing humanitarian crisis. The UN has made an appeal for $1 billion in 2021. Millions of Somalis are experiencing severe food insecurity, which the UN estimates will increase to 5.9 million by the end of 2021. Concerted support from the international community is essential to support Somalia's long-term stability. Our partners in the African Union and the AMISOM troop contributing countries have made huge sacrifices in supporting Somalia as it works to re-establish control of its own security. The Council this week will consider a renewed mandate that sets a path towards greater Somali leadership on security. To conclude, I want to emphasise 3 points. First, it's vital that the federal government and federal member states reach an agreement and ensure the delivery of credible and inclusive elections. Second, longer-term cooperation between the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states is essential to address issues critical to Somalia's stability, security, and development. Finally, the continued support of the international community is crucial to realising long-term peace and security in Somalia. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mohammed Abdirazak Mohammed, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Somalia. You have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to begin by congratulating you, Madam President, on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of February and wish you and your delegation success for the remainder of the month. I also commend the permanent representative of the brotherly country of Tunisia for his exemplary leadership at the helm of the Council last month. I acknowledge the presence of James Swan, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Somalia and head of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Somalia. Madeira, Special Representative of the African Union Commission, Chairperson for Somalia. Madam Rita Laranjiha, European Union Managing Director for Africa, and thank them for their briefings. It is a great honor to be addressing the UN Security Council on Somalia's progress and remaining challenges. The UN Security Council members, alongside the majority of other partner nations within the UN family, continue to play an important role in Somalia's development alongside our resilient people and government, both bilaterally and multilaterally. The Somali government takes note of the report of the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, on the situation in Somalia, which was presented to the Security Council today. The report captures succinctly the political, security, and socioeconomic challenges the Somali nation must overcome in order to continue our path to deepening democracy, development, stability, and security for Somalia. It is important to note the Somali people will be forever indebted for the support of multifaceted partnerships that continue to contribute to our national progress, especially as we navigate forward to a better future. A bright and confident future. I believe we are the masters of our own destiny. Political developments. Madam President, on the present political impasse on the implementation of the 17 September Agreement, context is important. The federal government of Somalia has worked consistently in a determined manner to hold federal election as stipulated by the provisional constitution. It should be noted, soon after the commencement of this administration, work to implement the holding of one person, one vote began, simply in order to ensure the widest participation of citizens to choose their leaders for the first time in 50 years. A practical model for realizing this goal was designed and negotiated with the FMS before they and the FGS signed an agreement in 2018. I'm very much aware of this because I led on the negotiations on behalf of the federal government and as a member of the Federal Negotiations Technical Committee, working closely with the federal member states. After this agreement, a draft law was formulated by the executive branch based on the agreement and was presented to the federal parliament for legislative scrutiny and voted on before the president assented it into law in February 2020. As stipulated, both by the political agreement and the subsequent election law, the process was to be led by the National Independent Electoral Commission. However, within a short period, the FMS leaders reneged on the early agreement on one person, one vote, and instead expressed a preference for a selection model similar to the one used in 2016, where the leadership of the FGS and FMS in effect chose the members of both houses of the federal parliament who would then become the electors of the president and the speakers. The selective process has rightfully earned the label of an incubator for levels of corruption, irregularities, and patronage, favored by elites whose sole interest is to hold the future of Somalia to ransom and maintain patronage for the few. Despite the moral and political imperative to implement the agreed election model, Somalia's international partners pressured the government to compromise with the federal member states Once again, and as a result of series of consultation with the federal member state leadership held in Dusamreb, known as Dusamreb Conference 1, 2, and 3, a final meeting of the National Consultative Council in Mogadishu reached a political agreement on the new modalities of election on September 17, 2020. It is to be noted that the federal government, in agreeing to this selected model, has not only compromised on one person, one vote, but it also had agreed to the following as demanded by the federal member states. For each seat, the federal government of Somalia wanted at least 301 individuals to vote for each respective parliamentary seat, but the federal member states wanted only 101. The FGS agreed. The FGS proposed elections should be held in up to 4 or minimum of 3 locations in each FMS in order to see greater legitimization of the new parliament. The FMS leaders wanted 2 locations. The FGS again accepted their wish. The penholders of this agreement were the federal member state leaders, in particular, the presidents of Jubaland and Puntland, and led to the agreement being welcomed, celebrated, and endorsed by all prospective presidential candidates, the federal member states, international community, and by all relevant political actors. Regrettably, after all of this, the penholders of this agreement, continue to refuse to implement the political agreement, requesting further concessions after another to address perceived concerns with regards to the Gedo region and the election committees. This was also accepted by the federal government of Somalia, and a technical committee representing all stakeholders, including ministerial representatives from both Jubaland and Puntland, finalized the outstanding issues in Baidoa on 16 February. After 2 days of discussions, the Baidoa Technical Committee's announcement, an agreement, and welcomed by all, including the international community, His Excellency President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed Farmajo extended an invitation to the federal member state leaders to meet at the National Consultative Council on February 18 in Mogadishu to conclude the FGS-FMS Technical Committee's work and fully implement the 17 September agreement so that the process of elections can begin without any further delays. Madam President, regrettably, the 2 federal member state leaders who were the penholders of the 17th September political agreement and have remained a constant obstacle to its finalization once again refused to attend the meeting, once again choosing to hold ransom the aspirations of the Somali people for stability in an effort to achieve a transition in an undemocratic manner. In fact, rather than travel to Mogadishu to attend the planned National Consultative Council meeting, the 2 FMS leaders chose to offer a tacit support to a planned protest by prospective presidential candidates, which the FGS accepted, provided that it adheres to public health and is held in a peaceful manner as our Constitution stipulates. The government fully recognizes the right to peacefully demonstrate as a right guaranteed by the Constitution. We are committed to providing the Somali people with the opportunity to express themselves and their demands without undermining public order or destroying public or private property. However, the prospective presidential candidates not only disregarded the government's measures, but chose a clear path of illegality and insurrection. They chose to bring forth a militia out onto the streets of Mogadishu. And in fact, the head of this militia openly stated in public, and I quote, "There is no government and we are taking control," unquote. This is of no surprise because on the night of February 18th, the opposition group leaders declared that there is no government. They have been saying this in Somalia, which is not true given Parliament passed the election law based on the political agreement, which under Article 3 clearly states the legislative and executive branches of government to have full authority, and furthermore, the executive is responsible for the management of the elections precisely in order to avoid a vacancy of power. These acts have led to loss of life of members of our security personnel who have taken an oath to protect the Somali nation from enemies, both foreign and domestic, and I extend my condolences and the gratitude of the nation to their families and loved ones, and wish those injured speedy recovery. The Somali people are tired of war and yearning for stability, security, and government which truly represents their aspirations. And key to achieving this is holding a free and fair elections as agreed by all the parties on the 17th of September and finalized by the Baidoa Technical Committee no more than a week ago. Madam President, denying the truth doesn't change the facts. And I'm afraid what we have here is an opposition whose only interest at the behest of external forces is to create red herring from the fact that their sole political goal has always been to cause political crisis in order to foment constitutional disorder. The fact is that the only way to have a political transition is through election, not threats or outlandish claims of political and social regression to a painful era the Somali people will never accept to returning to. The simple truth is, no amount of undemocratic calls for removal of a sitting president without election, the foreign axis of instability supporting the opposition, nor the threat of violence will determine the destiny of the Somali nation. Somalia's destiny will be determined by the Somali people who have the confidence, experience, and resolve to ensure what lies ahead for Somalia will never be the pain of the past. Unfortunately, the Somali federal government strongly believes there's blatant foreign interference in the internal political affairs of Somalia from those who claim to be helping to stabilize Somalia to those who offer princely reward in order to intentionally sabotage and prolong the electoral process in the hope of leadership change. This axis of foreign influence clearly has a strategy of prolonging the holding of elections by forcing the remaining two FMS leaders to refuse the agreement in order to provide space for prospective presidential candidate in an attempt to create a narrative of discord. Only today, the prospective presidential candidates have announced the holding of demonstrations next Friday and are clearly timed to coincide with this meeting in the hope of instilling fear of Armageddon. Rest assured, the prospective presidential candidates have and will continue to be provided the freedom and political space to express their views, and government bodies, as well as security forces, will fulfill their statutory duty to protect the public against the dark forces of extremism and the silent enemy of the pandemic while they express their views openly. However, the security and well-being of Somali people will remain paramount, and no armed insurrection under the guise of a political demonstration will be accepted. There is no doubt elections will happen once the final two FMS leaders endorse the finalization of the 17th September agreement negotiated by their respective technical representatives. Upon the agreement of these two FMS leaders, the FGS is willing and able to begin the holding of the election within the month. The President of Somalia once again invites the leaders of Puntland and Jubaland to join the consultative meeting in Mogadishu to finalize the recommendations of the technical committee. The completion of the electoral process based on dialogue and compromise is vital for the peace and prosperity of the Somali people. Madam President, on security developments, defeating Al-Shabaab remains Somalia's key security priority. We have been engaged in a successful fight against a determined international terrorist organization with regional...
I do apologize for interrupting. You've kindly covered a lot of ground and some important issues, but would it be possible to come to your final remarks now? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. I will then just go ahead and conclude. Madam President, to conclude, Somalia has truly come a very long way on a journey in which many thought it would not make it past the first few hurdles. Somalia's economic success is a fruit of the collective efforts of the Somali government, people, and our valuable international partners. The Somali people are resilient and committed to building a better future for themselves, of which they can be proud. As for politics, Somalia's political process has developed from the period in which it was initiated and developed by international partners only. However, since 2012, and in particular the last 4 years, Somali leaders have dealt with complex political issues without the supervision of the international community. This has in turn made the Somali people have confidence in their governance and their leaders. And despite recent events, the President's invitation to the remaining 2 federal member state leaders stands without delay. Because rebuilding an inclusive, progressive, and prosperous Somalia is fundamental for all Somalis, it is the commitment of this government to honor this noble objective by delivering free and fair elections while continuing to safeguard the physical, health, and financial future of the Somali people. I thank you all.
Minister Abdirazak Mohammed for his statement. That concludes the live broadcast portion of this meeting.